Welcome back to the OSM channel. In today's video, I'm going to unbox, test, and review this Bestarc BTC800DP 9th generation plasma cutter. So my arrangement with Bestarc, they agreed to send this unit out in exchange for an honest review video. And that's exactly what I'm going to provide, an honest review video. So why would you consider adding a plasma cutter to your tool arsenal? Well, if you're a mechanic, if you're a fabricator, or in the demolition business, I highly recommend you adding a plasma cutter to your arsenal at some point. So a plasma cutter is what I have found to be the easiest and quickest way to cut through steel. Once you have your machine set up and tuned correctly, it's almost as if this machine operates like a hot knife cutting through butter. So a plasma cutter works by using an electric arc to create a plasma stream that melts and cuts conductive metals. Now, I have the Miller plasma cutter back behind me here, and to be honest, I've only cut through mild steel in the past, but according to my research with a plasma cutter, you can cut through any conductive metal, such as mild steel, carbon steel, stainless, copper, brass, titanium, monel, inconel, and cast iron. Let me open up the box, I'll lay everything out on the table, and we can review everything that's included in the box and start going over the features of this unit. So we have a lot to get into here, but let's go over the basics. Let's go over what you get in the box and my initial thoughts. So first, you get this beautiful inverter-based machine. Inverter-based machine has a lot of internal electronics, but it's nice that it's lightweight, it's portable, and you have this nice, beautiful display up front. I'm noticing that there's an internal air regulator. My Miller doesn't have that, so that's a really nice touch right there. Really nice job on the finish, beautiful color. The plug that's installed in the machine right now is a 230 plug, a 50 amp 230 plug. Now, something I don't understand, mind you, I'm not an electrician. This is a 230 50 amp plug. However, they advertise that this machine is up to an 80 amp machine, so I don't understand how you can pump 80 amps through a 50 amp plug. Perhaps there's a capacitor or something I'm missing here. I just don't have the knowledge to really comment on that, but that's a question that I do have. On the back side of the machine, you have an air filter. I guess the regulator is internal, and of course you have this nice big breaker in the back, big cooling fan in the back. It just did a really nice job with the finish on this machine. You have some feet on this machine, so you know it's not sitting on the metal panel down there. Allows for some air to circulate underneath the machine and protect the nice paneling. Aside from that, obviously you have your torch, which there's a nice safety trigger right there. So you have to flip this up to get your finger in there. There is a little bit of damage to this torch, and I'm a little disappointed because I know this wasn't from the shipping process. This was from the manufacturer, because this was in a nice sealed cardboard box over there. So you see there's an aluminum leg right here for these guide wheels, and this one on the right is bent. So I'm going to try and straighten that out here momentarily, but the nice thing about these wheels is it suspends the tip of the torch off your material ever so slightly, maybe a quarter inch, something like that. When you are using a plasma cutter, you never want to touch this torch tip directly on your material because it'll gum up the tip. So these wheels are definitely a nice touch, and it should allow for a nice, smooth, clean cut. As for the quality of the torch, it's about what you'd expect for the cost of this machine. It doesn't feel super cheap, but it doesn't feel super high-end either. Feels adequate. There's jacketing material. Feels like a rubber jacketing material around the lead. I forget if I mentioned it already, but I measured this. It's about 15 or 16 feet long, so that's a nice long lead. Aside from that, here is, so this is pretty cool. This is a voltage converter plug. So this machine can run on 380, which is not going to be applicable for Americans. Obviously, it comes with that 230 plug. And then it also includes this 115 converter. So this allows you to plug the machine in to 115. 110, the max we can pump through this machine is 40 amps. And the max thickness material that we can cut on 110 is 5/16. So we'll have to see if we can test that a little bit later on here. Of course, we have our ground clamp, and I have not measured this. I will measure this momentarily. We have an air line, which I don't think most of us are going to be using, because on the back side of this machine you can see that there's a nipple, so you can just plug in a standard quick connect air coupler to the back of the machine, so really not needed. It looks like we have some extra consumables. For the length of the ground clamp, I'm going to guess 10 feet, but we will find out right now. 2 inches shy of 10 feet. 9 foot 10. Then as for the ground clamp itself, smooth action. You have this nice woven copper internally on this clamp. So definitely adequate for the price range. Pretty satisfied with that. So here's that bent wheel. I've been trying to straighten it out with this bench vise. You know, sometimes you get bent aluminum, you try and straighten it out, and then it tends to crack. Doesn't really bend back well all the time. But I will say this, Bestarc does care about their image, and they have a very responsive customer service team. So if any units arrived like this, I'm sure that they would correct the problem, no questions asked. See, that's pretty straight now. See some of the stress cracks there now. So it's a little weak, but they'll probably send me out a new one if asked. I could always make a new one too, but that's good enough. I also figured before we plug this unit in, let's take a closer look at the torch head and go over how to replace consumables. So it is really nice that they have these wheels here. Again, that keeps the torch tip suspended above the material, and it should, in theory, allow you to make really clean, smooth cuts. Now, what if you don't want this thing on here? What if you don't want this big, bulky wheel assembly? Well, no big deal. There's 2 knurled bolts, so you would simply loosen these 2 bolts. You could rotate this or remove the assembly. Then as for removing the consumables, we have our included wrench. So we're going to rotate this counterclockwise. There is the torch tip. And as for the other piece, the other internal piece, let's see if we figure this out. There is some knurling on there, but we may have to remove this white cup. So this white cup spins off counterclockwise as well, and then we have our square in the middle of this tool. Again, counterclockwise. That would remove this other internal piece. Now, before we plug in and turn on this machine, we need to connect all our components to these front connections. So the bottom 3 connections are going to be for the torch. We have our torch connection, pilot R connection, and then our trigger connection. So there is a rubber cap that protects the brass threads here. We will simply thread this connection on, get it hand tight, work on our pilot arc connection. That's going to be the red wire. So I'm going to pull off this knurled nut, remove the flat washer, then install the red wire. A little too much slack in this wire, if you ask me. Like, where do you put this? I don't know. Put the flat washer back on, knurled nut, tighten her down. Do I have that facing up? I don't know, maybe we'll do something like that and put a little zip tie on there, I guess. And then finally, our trigger connection, and there's a little alignment slot right there, so that's going to face down. Then another knurled nut, just spin that on by hand, get that tight. I wish they included an extra zip tie for this, but no matter. Go grab a zip tie and zip tie this to the lower connector. And then finally, we need to insert our ground clamp connection. So there's a little protrusion on this brass piece. I think it's brass anyway, so that's going to face down. Insert it, rotate clockwise until tight. And our ground connection is now installed. So I really like this chart they have on top of the machine. Gives you the thickness, what this machine can cut on different voltages. So we have the 380 voltage, which is not going to apply to us. What is going to apply to us is the 220 voltage and the 110 voltage. So currently I have that adapter plug on the end of the machine, and we are currently going to be trying this machine out first on 110. So according to this chart, at 110, if we set the machine to 40 amps, we're going to adjust our air pressure to 40 to 45 psi. this machine should be able to cut 5/16 inch steel. So let's test that. And then also for the 220, it says if we adjust the voltmeter up to 80 amps, 60 to 70 psi, apparently this can cut 1-inch thick steel. I'm not going to push it that hard. I'm a little bit worried about my electrical system in the house here. So let's see what this thing can do on 110 first. Here's our air filter on the back of the machine. Plug my quick connect in. Next I'm going to flip that breaker switch on the back of the machine to turn the machine on and see what happens. Going through the startup cycle. So let's start going over the controls. Obviously we have a nice bright display. Starting on the top, illuminated in green, we have our input voltage, in this case 110. We have our amps, and we have all these different settings. So let's start going down the line here. Now starting on the top left, we can set this to cut or air. So if we press this button, this top left button, and go to air, it momentarily, well, it flows air until you shut it off, but it flows air to the torch. Where I find this to be useful is when I'm trying to adjust the air pressure with the regulator. Like to start, we're going to be on 110 and we're going to try and cut that 5/16 plate. So according to the top of the machine, we want the air regulator to be set between 40 to 40 psi. So I'm going to start winding this regulator down. Of course, you would pull this out and then rotate. So we're going to set this to maybe 42. So I'm going to flow air momentarily, go back to cut, and I'm going to see where my pressure's at. In this case, it's changed to 36. So I'm going to bump this back up to, I don't know, 43, 44. So we'll flow air again, check our pressure again. It's a little high now. And that's pretty good right there. So it's a good way to help set the regulated pressure on your machine. If we move down, one on the left, we could set this machine to cut plate or mesh. We're going to leave it on plate. On the top right, we have 2T and 4T. So here's how this basically works. I'd recommend leaving it in 2T setting, and that means when you pull the trigger, the arc is going to be present until you release the trigger. That's 2T. Now if you were to switch it to 4T, what happens when you pull the trigger and let go, the arc is going to remain until you pull the trigger again. In that case, then the arc would stop. So I'd recommend just keeping it in 2T. It's a more simple setting. Now as for the PA and PT, so the PA, according to my understanding, the instructions are a little rough here, but PA stands for the post arc. So after you let go of the trigger and you want, the arc to stop, you can adjust the amount of time that arc stays present after you release the trigger. In this case, I have it set to 3 seconds. And go back to PA, so post arc, and you can adjust this between 3 to 15 seconds. I'm going to leave it on 3. And then if we go down one, we have post time, if I understand that correctly. So that's how long the air will continue to blow out that nozzle after you release the trigger. So we have the arc set to continue for 3 seconds after we release the trigger. And then as for the post air time, I'm going to set it to 10 seconds. You can adjust this between 3 to 15 seconds. I feel like 3 and 10 is a pretty good setting. And then of course on the right we have our amp setting, and on 110 we can max this out at 40 amps. Which again, I don't really understand that either, because this 115 circuit that I currently have the machine plugged into is probably a 15 or 20 amp circuit. So I don't know, maybe there's a big capacitor in here that holds a charge, something like that. I guess, I don't know. Anyway, we're going to try and cut some 5/16 inch metal now on 110, and we'll see what this machine can or can't do. Alright, so let's try cutting some 5/16 inch plate on 115. My thickness gauge, this is an old plow blade. As you can see, it's right at 5/16. So I have the piece grounded. The fan is going off because I did a quick test cut. I recommend shade 7 glasses. Also have a face shield on and a welding jacket on. I'm going to throw on my welding gloves and we'll see how well this machine does cutting through this 5/16 plate on 110, 115. we tripped the breaker. Yeah, that's why I don't like using 110, 115. So, yeah, I don't recommend the 115 for cutting thick stuff like this. I'm not going to risk the electrical wires in the garage any further, so we're not even going to push it any further. $20 amp. I've swapped the machine over to 220. Here are the 110 settings. Here are the 220, 230 settings. So we're still trying to cut that 5/16 inch plate. So our settings should be somewhere in this range. So we're going to set the machine somewhere between 50 to 60 amps. And the air pressure should be between 50 to 60 psi. Machine is set at 53 amps. And our air pressure is 58 psi. Again, we're on 220 now. Beautiful. So one thing I can say I definitely like about this machine thus far is it's really efficient with air. I've cut through about 15 inches of that 5/16 inch steel on and off camera thus far. You're currently looking at the pressure regulator on my 60-gallon air compressor tank. Prior to starting this test, I charged this compressor up to 150 psi. Kind of hard for me to tell, but we're probably at like 138 right now, so we've only dropped 12 psi. And mind you, the pressure regulator on the machine right now set, I think, to around 55 psi. So if you only have one 220 or 230 plug like I do, this machine with that internal regulator is just so efficient. You could cut for quite some time before having to unplug the machine and recharge your air compressor tank. So what are my final thoughts on this Bestarc Plasma Cutter? Well, I have a lot to say. Let's start off with the bad. So we tried to cut through this 5/16 inch plate on 110 voltage. It ended up tripping the circuit breaker at my circuit breaker panel. Now, we were following all the manufacturer's guidelines. We had the air pressure set properly. You know, we were in a 20 amp circuit. We had our amp set all the way up to 40 amps. And you know, we only got 2 or 3 inches in, probably 2 inches in, before it tripped the circuit breaker on the panel. I would have hoped that the circuit breaker on the machine would have tripped first. So thankfully that circuit breaker on my main panel did its job, and my internal wiring in the house is not damaged. But also it shouldn't have got to that point. So that definitely put a bad taste in my mouth. But on the other side of things, think about it from a fabricator's point of view. You know, doing any kind of welding or plasma cutting on 110 voltage generally is not recommended. And really, if you're doing fabrication, you have to be on 220, 230 voltage. So for it to get 2 inches in the 5/16 plate, it's kind of impressive, but also, again, just put a bad taste in my mouth that it tripped the circuit breaker. Now, once we swapped this machine over to 220, 230 voltage, it was a different animal. It was cutting through that 5/16 inch plate like nothing. Really smooth, clean cuts. I really like the rollers here. This machine states that it can cut up to 1 inch thick steel on 220 voltage. If you crank up the amps all the way up to 80 amps, you set your air pressure to 60 to 70 psi. That would make me quite uncomfortable. Where I feel this machine would do very well is when you're on 220, 230 voltage and you're cutting anything less than a ½ inch thick. When you start going above that, I'd be a little bit leery about tripping the circuit breaker at that point. I'm not going to test it. I'm not going to push my luck. Just, I think ½ inch plate and thinner, 220, 230 voltage, you're going to be safe. You're going to be a very satisfied user. So that is my recommendation. Now, aside from that, some other things I really like about the machine. Obviously, the finish. I like how many settings you have. You really can go through a lot of adjustments in the menu and really fine-tune this machine as to where you like it. Now, one of my favorite things about this machine, honestly, is that internal pressure regulator. You can fine-tune your pressure regulation settings and just be really efficient with the amount of air that you're pumping through this machine. You know, As mentioned earlier, after going through about 15 inches of 5/16 inch plate, my 60-gallon air compressor only dropped 13 psi, and I consider that to be very good. So if you only have one 230 plug available, I'd load up your air compressor tank. Of course, you need a large air compressor, right? Like, I'd recommend 60 gallons and larger. But if you load up your 60-gallon tank, I mean, you're going to be able to cut a lot of steel before you're going to have to unplug this machine and swap back over to your air compressor to recharge it. But the internal air regulator on this machine, phenomenal. The digital pressure gauge on this machine worked extremely well, just really well thought out. So overall, would I recommend this machine? Depends what you're doing. If you have 220, 230 voltage and you plan to cut, you know, 1/2 inch thick steel or thinner, 100% recommend it. Good buy. If you're looking to cut larger, think about going for a higher quality machine. And if you're thinking about doing any kind of work on 110, 115, stick with the thinner material. I wouldn't go thicker than an 1/8 inch, 5/16. It'll probably trip your circuit breaker. So that's all I have to say on this machine. I'd like to thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know in the comment section down below. And as always, I will catch you on the next one.